Welcome to today's webinar called Getting to Know TACT, an open source tool for adjusting and evaluating remote sensing turbulence measurements. Before getting going here, I would like to draw your attention to the logo that accompanies the energy yellow leaf on this title slide. It's the CFARS logo. Not only am I representing NRG today, but I'm also representing the Consortium for Advancing Remote Sensing, and the TACT tool is a result of that entity's endeavor, supported by NRG along the way, also with the help of dozens of other organizations and individuals that have contributed to this tool and this project. NRG believes in the utility of this project and the importance of this initiative as a whole, and that is why we would like to bring it to your attention through this platform in this webinar today. The first thing I want to do here is to present the outline for the following webinar, what we will be covering here today. First, I would like to give an introduction to TACT with a bit of background info so that we can establish where the tool has come from and why it was created. Second, I will discuss how TACT might be used with an example. I will then shed some light on the value of TACT as an open source project and why that approach has been beneficial so far. And finally, we will set a moment at the end here to address what the next steps are for this project. So first, let's talk about where TACT came from and why it was created in the first place. And in doing that, we must also introduce the group called CFARS for those of you who may not be familiar. So the way we're going to do this is to actually just dissect the acronym. TACT stands for Turbulence Intensity Adjustment Comparison Tool. And so first, what is turbulence intensity? When I say turbulence intensity, I am referring to a parameter measured in pre-construction campaigns that is generally abbreviated as TI, and it is the quantification of an intensity of wind velocity fluctuations. Today, we'll be talking about TI in terms of 10-minute data intervals, where it is calculated as the ratio of wind speed standard deviation over wind speed average for that interval. Also, we typically look at TI in each wind speed bin, which is what this N is referring to in the equation outlined in orange. Next question is, why are we adjusting this parameter? And the simple answer is that TI from a met mass that contains an anemometer is not the same thing as TI from a remote sensing device. Physical differences in the way that these two instruments measure wind speed, especially over a 10-minute interval, such as the fact that one is measuring a point observation while the other, the LiDAR in this case, is sampling a volume, results in a ratio of wind speed standard deviation to the average that does just not mean the same thing between these two instruments. Now, this concept really sets up the reason for why we have a tool like TACT, why we've put development efforts into this tool. And so we're going to spend a moment here to go a little further and dig a little bit more into this question. It turns out that understanding and characterizing TI turbulence intensity is currently critical to site suitability assessments, namely in order to choose a suitable turbine for a given site, and also to ensure that the project has an optimal monitoring and operating strategy in place moving forward as it is developed. And the process we currently use ingests anemometer data to understand turbulence intensity at a given site, and the collected data from the met mast is typically fed to a turbine OEM's unique fatigue loads model, and out comes the result that indicates how to make these key suitability decisions for a given project. Now, if we introduce this alternative measurement principle, we ideally then are striving for a proper and robust interpretation of both instruments, the anemometer and the LiDAR, in which we can run through loads models separately and effectively extract actionable results. And if there's any ambiguity in these middle steps, that prevents us from really having good actionable results or clear actionable results. And in that case, we're not really making the best use of the technologies we have available. So as we work on executing on this path and doing that appropriately, another perhaps accelerated option for handling pre-construction remote sensing data that really doesn't require a full rethink of turbine component fatigue loads models is this idea that we can preserve as much of our data interpretation process as possible and work on refining how we handle LiDAR data or other remote sensing data alongside anemometer data. And quick note, throughout this presentation, I use LiDAR data and remote sensing device data pretty interchangeably, and just for use, sometimes I simplify and represent RSD data as LiDAR data, but I will note that that can also mean something like SODAR data. But so largely, while we work on the bigger goal from the slide previous here, the industry has decided that a productive path forward is to proceed in adjusting RSD data so that it represents TI closer to the way that an anemometer would for compatible use in loads models. So in other words, we want the loads models to produce the same result with the LiDAR data as they do with the anemometer data. And the way that we do that is by adjusting the LiDAR data. And for now, we can measure the effect of that adjustment via both the resulting representation of the TI parameter, turbulence intensity, and also via the loads model output themselves. And because we do not have an open source load model at this time as an industry, TACT focuses on TI characterization as an intermediate. But conceptually, we also advocate for looking downstream to impact on loads models, which we'll come back to in a little bit if you stay with me here. Okay, so finishing up this acronym, TACT is a comparison tool. So by now, you've probably deduced that its intent is to compare different representations of turbulence intensity from some project dataset. So it takes as an input a time series of remote sensing data and also a reference dataset at the same location and time. And TACT is the entity, the code, that processes that data. And it outputs project results that compare TI from the anemometer and the RSD to a set of different adjusted RSD datasets. Okay, a little bit more on that output. TACT has actually compiled an assortment of LiDAR and RSD TI adjustment methodologies from members of the industry consortium called CFARS. So when I talk about all these different representations of TI, adjusted TI, I'm talking about just the different adjustment methods output. So these contributing members have included several different types of stakeholders. They've been developers, they've been LiDAR OEMs, they've been turbine OEMs, they've been consultants. There are resulting approximately about a dozen different methodologies that will all run on a data set that TACT is executed on or asked to interact with. And they all operate on 10-minute average data, and a subset of them can even be executed on just standalone LiDAR data without the need for feeding TACT a co-located masked dataset. So these methods are very diverse in nature, and they include different types of adjustments, from simple slope and offset adjustments to methods that rely on frequency domain decomposition, some machine learning methods, as well as empirically based transfer functions derived from several aggregated project data sets. A few highlighted outputs are, one of them is just the adjusted time series data. So for each timestamp, in addition to the raw data, TACT will output a TI value derived from each of the n adjustment methods represented by these columns in this schematic of output results. For each adjustment method, the tool also computes binned TI and representative TI, an example of which is depicted in these plots shown here, where the orange line represents the reference anemometer data, binned. The light blue is the raw remote sensing device data, binned. And the gray data is one single adjustment method represented in the same binned fashion as the raw data. And this data set also happens to have a second anemometer available for analysis, and that's indicated by this dark blue curve here. So such a view allows us to compare the binned representation of turbulence intensity between each realizations of the project data. In addition to binned TI, TACT also outputs statistical metrics used to evaluate method performance, such as mean bias error, root mean squared error, bias, and also regression analysis statistics. So I cannot talk about TACT without talking about CFARS, which again stands for the Consortium for Advancing Remote Sensing. And CFARS, with its truly diverse group of supporting members, are focused on the following overarching goals. Their mission statement is to increase the acceptance of remote sensing devices by sharing information and involving the broad industry, to reduce project development costs by supporting and enabling standardization and the acceptance of RSDs, and also to reduce the uncertainty of pre-construction estimates by demonstrating and leveraging the value of remote sensing devices. You can find important and detailed CFARS content in the following locations, including the website and on LinkedIn in these links. You may read more about this project from the white paper, also linked here. And then finally, you may access the TACT code and the TACT tool from the CFARS GitHub repository, which is in this last link here. So now that I've introduced TACT, I want to discuss some use cases for this tool, how a user might actually implement TACT, and then look at some example results. So some example uses of TACT are as follows. A user may want to compare adjustment methods for given project data site just to see how well different types of methods or different specific methods might perform. A user might also want to evaluate adjusted data, pre-adjusted data, so they've adjusted the data themselves and they evaluate the performance of that method with TACT performance metrics and statistical output. So using TACT as kind of the standardized agreement on performance metrics and evaluation. And then a user might also want to potentially even generate a trained adjustment model from their own project data, and that's enabled by TACT as well. And how does it work? At a high level, it is useful to understand that the first step for a user is to do some data preparation. Make sure that they're providing TACT with a filtered and cleaned data set along with a configuration file that allows the tool to be able to interpret the provided data correctly. And templates for the following for those are just located in the TACT repository in the GitHub link. The actual running of the tool is set up to happen via command line after acquiring the repository, so there is no GUI interaction or anything like that. It's code execution in the command line. So now on to our kind of quick example of one instance, one use of TACT. One thing that the tool is great for is to be able to compare different methodologies for adjusting data, and that's a primary function of the tool output. And so a user more specifically might want to understand how different types of models behave on their specific project data. So one potential characterization scheme for kind of categorizing types of methods is to understand methods as either site-specific or global. And what I mean by site-specific are models and methods that are trained at the site where they are being evaluated. These models are configurable as TACT output, so users can not only evaluate them, but also generate them from their site-specific data that they're putting into TACT. TACT has 6 different site-specific models and methods included for analysis. And those methods are expected to perform well because they're trained on sort of the conditions and the environmental conditions, the atmospheric conditions that they will be evaluated on. What I mean by global models are models that are trained on sites or a site separate from where they are evaluated. They can be applied to data without a reference anemometer present, although it's harder to evaluate them in that scenario. But these models improve when more data is used in the training of them. And TACT global models include 2 regression models with slope and offset adjustments derived from multiple projects. Also, on the order of 3 machine learning regression models and a frequency domain decomposition model. So these models are potentially more useful for the industry because we do not need to collect new data to use them. They can be presumably trained by as much input data as we have available to try to characterize different environmental and atmospheric conditions, and then we can just deploy them to multiple projects without having to recreate the model. So a potential question is, how are these global methods performing on my site compared to more locally trained site-specific models? So what I've done is I've run TACT on 3 different project sites, and my primary output is the binned turbulence intensity. It looks like this. The black line is my reference data, anemometer data, and the blue line is my LiDAR data. Lastly, these gray lines in between represent the data set adjusted several different times using various different adjustment methodologies. So right off the bat, we notice that these blue and black lines, the reference anemometer and the RSD, LiDAR data, do not agree off the bat in their representation of turbulence intensity. And we also notice that after adjustment, there's quite a bit of variability in how the adjustment turbulence intensity looks as well. Now, if we take the same data, we can look at it in a slightly different way to perhaps see the differences between methods even more clearly. These plots represent the same data as in the previous slide, but in this version, the representative TI is normalized to the reference data so that each marker can be interpreted as the ratio of TI from the LiDAR or adjusted LiDAR to the TI from the reference anemometer. The dashed line at 1 represents an equal TI measurement from each instrument, and points above 1 indicate bins where the LiDAR or the adjusted LiDAR demonstrated a higher value of TI in that particular wind speed bin, and then conversely, when values are less than 1, that LiDAR data represented a lower value of TI for that particular wind speed bin. Also, we have colored the site-specific methods in green, and then the global methods are in gray. Some observations we were able to make are then that the site-specific methods overcorrected in project 2_1, but also outperformed global models in low wind speed bins projects 2_1 and 1_3. In general, global models seem to be performing a little bit better at higher wind speed bins, and that might be due to too little site-specific project data in the training data set for the site-specific project data to be adjusted optimally in these bins in this case. So we do see some promising performance of global methods, and that is interesting as an observation from these 3 different project outputs. So how do results like this actually play into the larger picture for handling TI data for pre-construction assessments? If TACT enables data owners, project owners, and analysts to run the tool and understand the RSD data better and how adjusting it might actually impact their campaign results, there's further potential that the information and output from a tool like TACT can potentially and theoretically be run through turbine fatigue load models and evaluated by the data owners in conjunction with a specific turbine OEM. And then CFARS and TACT contributors contend that those results can help in commercial conversations to enable better data-informed decision-making for given project data. All stakeholders can come to the table a little bit more informed with a little bit more understanding of how LiDAR data can be interpreted and used for that project. So here's an example of just that sort of extra step on top of TACT. So for this plot, Vestas has actually taken TACT output for one of the 3 project data sets that I've just shown and presented here. And they have run a fatigue loads model to evaluate turbulence impacted component outputs, normalize again to the same response from the reference data. And you can see the yellow line here shows that LiDAR project data has overrepresented loads by up to as much as 7% compared to a reference. And then 2 different TACT outputs are picked and shown here to demonstrate in orange and green colors. And both of these are global models in this case. And we can see that one of these methods, the green, really shows very favorable results in the fatigue loads model when compared to the reference, so very close to that 1-to-1 ratio line, where there's really within 1% agreement to the reference for every single component on this list here. So we've just finished up kind of running through an example of how we might use TACT and look at the output data. Now I think it's worthwhile to talk really briefly about CFARS' experience in creating and leveraging an open source approach to TACT. Quickly, we're going to talk about just a few advantages that have been observed from this approach specifically. So the first is that collaboration just leads to a better output. The open source approach has let CFARS members share methods aimed at adjusting LiDAR data as accurately or as optimally as possible to get the best possible agreement with the reference data. So a representation of just a great adjustment or a good adjustment result that we'd like to dig into further on the right here, where we've got this yellow line representing, or yellow data representing adjusted from TACT output, and the blue line representing original LiDAR data. So the goal is to just do that better and optimally with respect to the reference, and sharing and collaborating can get us that much closer. This approach has also enabled the consensus around useful comparison metrics and outputs so that we can make a better and faster progress with these shared understanding of what metrics are useful for evaluation. Collaboration within CFARS for TACT has also allowed research components to this analysis that enable us to investigate and look into unique model sensitivities, such as performance of these different adjustment methodologies with respect to something like stability characterization. So let's take a moment to look at these two plots here on the right. For a single data set, CFARS looked at the performance of adjustment methods after splitting the data into 5 different stability classes. So the plot on the top represents results for class 1, where the red line is the amount of error for each bin, comparing a second anemometer to the original reference anemometer, showing very little error across all wind speed bins. And then the green line is error comparing the remote sensing device to the reference. And then the shaded region is the range of different errors observed after adjusting that remote sensing data. So what's notable here is that error is overall lower in class 1 compared to class 5 for this particular data set. And it's insights like this and sensitivities like this which allow us to just understand further how adjustment methodologies are operating and what different sensitivities to good or bad performance of these adjustments might be. An additional benefit to the setup of TACT is that we can test sensitivities to different model generation schemes in a similar research fashion. We can get a better understanding of how the length of model training time, for instance, so the amount of training data that goes into model generation, might impact performance. Also, we can investigate how location of model training impacts results. And that allows us to get sort of optimal strategies for creating models, and then also allows us to understand caveats and potential pitfalls of applying an inappropriate model to a given project site. Another big advantage to the open source project is that by sharing code, users can keep the data and also any proprietary adjustment methods private, while also exploring available open methods and making use of shared performance metrics. So it allows us to keep kind of open methods and closed data and closed proprietary methods, which is useful for just increasing collaboration and increasing investigative involvement overall. Lastly, TACT can be used on top of other workflows and can augment existing analysis techniques and learned data analysis strategies already existing within organizations. So we advocate for the fact that TACT can be broadly used. Different entities, different companies may implement calls to the TACT repository on top of whatever data analysis strategies already exist. I do hope that this overview has been helpful and that you walk away with a greater understanding of the efforts existing within the industry, particularly CFARS, to adjust and then evaluate adjusted turbulence intensity data from remote sensing devices to benefit sort of our advancing the technology overall. But before I end, I will just list a few of the next steps for the CFARS team and for the TACT project so that you can be sure to follow along. First, please look out for and support, if you can, the continued input from the industry So the more methods are always welcome, more analysis tracks and insight are always welcome. So be in touch and get involved if you wish. Additionally, more results from TACT run on individual proprietary project datasets are always welcome to be submitted to CFARS via the website and via kind of getting in touch with CFARS leadership team. Furthermore, CFARS is also welcoming actual data submissions to just test with TACT and receive output analysis from the tool produced by CFARS teammates. Additionally, CFARS will be publishing TACT-based technical paper, technical results on a broader investigation with many more project datasets. And then to follow up, NRG hopes to have a webinar with an update regarding further conclusions from that CFARS publication. So be on lookout for part 2 of today's webinar to see kind of how adjustment methods are playing out and what some bigger, broader conclusions we can make. And with that, I will thank everyone for attending today's webinar.